Thank you for inviting us to share our latest research on optimal learning and to share some ideas for making future education even more engaging and meaningful. My name is Mette Ledertoug. I am a senior lecturer at University of East London and I'm part of the staff at the Master Program for Positive Psychology and Coaching Psychology. My special area of expertise is positive education.
And I'm Nanna Paarup, and I'm an educational consultant. I've been training teachers for the last 20 years, writing 15 books on teaching, professional learning communities, brain breaks, storytelling, etc. All of these are for teachers, including a lot of tools and strategies focusing on how to engage the students even more and to make sure that they thrive and learn at the same time. Mette and I are both former MAP students at Aarhus University in Copenhagen, Denmark. We met in 2011.
Before I went into academia, I was an educational psychologist for 20 years. And of course, I have observed good teaching as well as bad teaching before. And I have observed students being bored and not learning optimally. But it was in 2016 when we joined the Danish Conference on Wellbeing. This was the first conference on a national survey of well-being for students in elementary school. At the conference, they published results that showed that 26% of students in Danish schools, they are bored often or very often. 26% of students. When I came home, I had dinner with my husband and my son Victor. And we were discussing the day and I was very surprised about the results that I've heard about at the conference, and I was sharing this with my family. And my son turned to me and said he was very surprised too. He had expected the numbers to be even higher. I turned to my son and asked him, "Honey, this is not about being bored once in a while. This is about being bored often or very often or to a very high degree. So if you reflect upon your own situation, how would that look then?" And he thought for a minute and then he said, "I would be bored often or very often 50% of the time that I'm in school." This was a shock to me because that meant that every day when I'm sending my son to school, I would know that for at least 2 or 3 hours, he would be very bored. And I knew if that was my job, I would quit immediately. So this led us to focus on battling boredom in schools and to focus on engagement in education.
We really wanted to change and develop the learning environment in schools with a focus on positive education. The first book we wrote together, as Mette just mentioned, was together with Louise Tidman and Nadia Holmgren, and it was published in English in 2019, The Battle Against Boredom in Schools. This inspired us to dig even deeper into engaging education, and in 2021 we published a chapter in the Palgrave Handbook of Positive Education on this topic. Our focus on engagement and battling boredom led us to discussions about optimal learning. How can schools do even better in the future? There is far too much poor teaching in schools all over the world. Too much boredom, too much superficial learning, too little engagement and lack of meaning. Too much teaching time is spent on content that is not transferable and applied in students' lives outside of school.
This is a quote from our recent research project, The Quest for Optimal Learning. There are, of course, many talented teachers and excellent teachings in schools around the world. But learning, as we see in traditional schools today, is based on 200-year-old traditions, and we already know that we do not equip children and adolescents well for the future, and that is far from optimal. But what is optimal learning, and does it even exist? By curiosity, we Googled optimal learning definitions, and we came across 2 different attempts at catching the precise content of optimal learning. But none of these definitions are based on science. Instead, we set out on a quest, inviting 18 international researchers and experts for an interview on optimal learning. What are their perspectives upon the concept? What are their vision for future education? What are the possible barriers and the strategies to overcome these barriers?
We gathered different perspectives on optimal learning, from Hans-Henrik Knoop sharing how we and our body always strives at being optimal, to James Nottingham saying that we can only experience optimal learning in glimpses. David Bott inspires us to not just look for the mean, the average, as in Hattie's well-known work on visible learning, but to look for the outliers, to be learning from the best. So let's share one of the statements from the expert Hans-Henrik Knoop. He says, "It is almost redundant to say that good learning is good, or that one should of course strive for good learning. To raise the bar even further and talk about optimal learning, he would say that all our physiology and psychology tend towards optima. Our body temperature regulates to be optimal, and the blood sugar strives to be optimal, and the entire needs regulation in the body and brain is aimed at optimal functioning. If something is not super optimal, then it hurts a little, or it's a bit uncomfortable. It may arouse a little uneasiness to balance our function, and this way optimal is normal. In the popular sense of optimal, the optimal often becomes a super performance perfectionism. And then of course it's a different story, because the optimal thing is not that something is perfect, but that one strives for it to be." And Hans-Henrik Knoop continues, "When we talk about optimal learning, that is really the normal thing. For example, if you learn less than you can, you may experience a degree of boredom or discomfort. You will not learn as much or as well as you could, or as quickly as you would be able to. It implies discomfort and is suboptimal, and there is room for improvement. And it is not an extravagant requirement or luxury, so I would argue for the normalization of the concept of optimal." The substance of what he is talking about is uncontroversial. There will be not many arguments against an optimal body temperature, and there are few arguments against learning how to use your potential properly. The eudaimonic part of positive psychology is aiming for the using one's potential optimal. This is a matter of fulfilling. After all, there is no such thing as half-feeling.
This was just one of the examples of how the expert consider what optimal learning is or if is not. If we summarize the similarities of the expert's perspectives for optimal learning, it goes as follows. Optimal learning is a natural state that is automatically pursued by humans. There seems to be a strong correlation between play and learning, between experiment and construction. It involves the body, the senses, and the emotions. It is a versatile, varied learning of academic, personal, and social nature, and it is created in interaction between the teacher and the student. It is considered relevant and meaningful, preparing students for the future, and the knowledge and skills learned are transferable and applicable in life beyond school. It is a learning that challenges the students to his or her limits. It happens in moments or periods of optimal learning, the same way as we experience flow. So optimal learning is not an ambiguous term. It appears to be a complex concept achievable in moments or periods on an individual level, and in some instances at a collective level. So learning takes place on a continuum of suboptimal learning to optimal learning, and we will always try to strive to have as many moments of optimal learning as possible. And if that's not possible in school, it will be in the breaks, after school activities, in hobbies or computer games.
Optimal learning is complex, and the expert's visions for promoting it or creating the circumstances and surroundings for it to occur differs in multiple ways. Some of the visions are in the zone of proximity, and some of the visions are future-minded in every sense of the word. Researcher and futurist Anne Skar Nielsen argue, if the school is to prepare for a life in the future, it is good to consider what the future looks like. When Anne Skar Nielsen looks at the future education, she ranked 10 characteristics the children of the future cannot do without. Reading, writing, numeracy, and speaking foreign languages are at the bottom of this list. According to Anne Skar Nielsen, it is a nice to have, not a need to have, because we are moving away from text, speech, and manuals and towards graphics, videos, drawing, and intuitive systems. Other characteristics needed are think big and support the visionary urge to create. You must praise our geniuses, the misfits and the rebels, because the people who are crazy enough to think that they can change the world are the ones who do. It is also needed to balance mind, body and soul, to have a deep social intelligence, to make more proactive project thinking and to speak data. Furthermore, synthesis will be needed to be able to create an overview, see context, find meaning and draw it. And among the most important needed characteristics are to be able to learn, unlearn and relearn. Life is long and our children are going to reinvent themselves 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe even 7 times throughout their working lives. Dedicated communities will also be needed, as well as skills consisting of technique, method and persistence. One of our experts, David Budd, made a keynote speech in 2020 at the joint IPEN and Wellbeing 360 conference talking about future education, and he pointed out 10 mega trends for future education. We also share those in the book, so you can find them there if you want to know more.
One of the experts, Henrik Hovgaard, has quite future-minded visions for optimal learning. He says that he keeps an eye on how they create good learning in virtual reality, because according to him, this is a game changer. The only question is when and how transforming it will be. One version is the Oculus Quest. You put on goggles and a 3-dimensional world appears. Instead of the teacher making a history presentation and talking about the First World War, you simply put on goggles. Suddenly the student is amid a trench and can explore it himself. He must make sure he does not get shot, and he will get the feeling of what it was really like to be there. Afterwards he takes the goggles off again, and then he talks about what he has experienced, what he has seen and what he had to do along the way. So basically virtual reality or computer games which we see today, they are often played individually and maybe as part of an online community. If you only do that, we lose a lot of what forms us as people, where you're together and reflect on things together. So Hovgaard states that it is the teacher's task to ensure that we use it as a tool for good learning and to gain experience, but also to say, now we've had an experience, now there's an opportunity to talk about it. It must be a tool, an interaction between you solving a task, putting it down, and then discuss and make reflections. It is important to have both high tech, high touch. The more technological the world becomes, the more we need hearts, presence and consideration. At one point or another, you become saturated with technology and then you want to move on to something else. Hovgaard often searches the internet for ideas for implementing these things in teaching where it can really make a difference. We are not there yet, but the leaps in development are coming faster and faster.
So based on the expert's vision for optimal learning and future learning, we asked educational expert Richard Gerver whether we needed a revolution or an evolution of education, and he replied. Sir Ken Robinson and him used to talk an awful lot about revolution and evolution, and one of the things that Sir Ken Robinson said to Richard was that revolutions do not happen at 2 o'clock on a Monday afternoon. They start in the coffee shops and wine bars. So if you think about the French Revolution, It started with a group of students talking over wine, coffee and beer about how they could build a better world. They built a movement that eventually became a revolution, and it did not start on day one with an armed group of people who stormed the Bastille. It started with one conversation between two people. This is absolutely where we should start. The language is different, but the approach is the same. He hates to use the term because of the world we live in these last years, but the way to change everything is through contagion. One person has a cold, they cough, and then they give it to two other people. Ken points about revolution was a fascinating one, but it is not just starting with the flags and the guns. It started years before with people talking in coffee shops, and that is exactly the point.
So the greatest danger for most of us is not that our aim is too high and we miss it, but that it's too low and we reach it. And this is a quote by Michelangelo. All this vision about creating optimal learning in schools led us to consider the possible barriers for just making it happen and the strategies to overcome obstacles and barriers along the way. The barriers to creating an updated school with optimal learning to prepare students for both the present and the future exist on several diverse levels. All levels are affected by external obstacles, and at all levels one can also meet internal obstacles. The barriers and obstacles take place on 4 distinct levels. The first level is the political level, where rules, legislation and appropriation set the framework for the teaching and the training that takes place in schools and educational institutions. The second level is the societal level, where culture and prejudice and norms and special interest of stakeholders and interest groups influences the current educational situation. The third level is the school management level, where the leadership as visionaries run the lead with the baton, creates commitment, ownership and common mission. And finally, the individual teachers level, where the individual teacher's competence, mindset, commitment and contribution create opportunities for optimal learning for the individual student and for the community. At the political level, one of the barriers mentioned by the expert Charlie Scudamore was, above all else, you need to have a government officials who understand education. You know, I think one of the weaknesses we've had in this country, Australia, is that the wrong people have been the ministers of education. They just do not understand it and they reflect it back. Ministers of education need to do a course in education, which is not based on what they experienced when they were younger, because a lot of them reflect on what they did and think of when they were successful in that system. Julia Gillard is the former Prime Minister of Australia. She was the first and only female Prime Minister. Before that, she was the Education Minister for many years under the Rudd government, and she was the person that welcomed the positive psychologist Martin Seligman in Australia. And she got all of the Education Minister people trained by Seligman at Gillard Grammar School. And she introduced some very good changes. She understood education, and the newspapers hounded her.
And Charlie Scudamore points to the future direction, a strategy for overcoming these barriers. He says, I think that education could be taken further. In Finland, he believed that education and health are not treated as a political football. There is a bipartisan approach. All sides of politics collaborate so that all children are given equal opportunities. In Australia, it is terrible, really, because the Conservative government believed in free education and the Labour government want greater state education. So there's always a conflict. And Charlie likes the idea of taking the politics out of education.
At the societal level, the expert Sue Ruffy further points to the role of our media and how their focus create barriers for education. She states, we have a media that does not always spark the conversation that we need to have. You know, it is the way powerful media moguls like Robert Murdoch, who have ridiculous amount of power, the way they write about things impact on the way people think about things. And Sue Ruffy thinks that we need to have a different sort of media, which is part of the conversation. We need to have a conversation that is ethical and far-thinking and compassionate and empathetic and promotes equity amongst people and respect and valuing all of our citizens as they grow all of our kids.
And maybe we need to learn a strategy from New Zealand. James Nottingham tells us that New Zealand has got a fabulous reputation for education. And the main reason why you and I think that New Zealand education is brilliant is because New Zealanders say that New Zealand is brilliant. They shout it out from the rooftop. And Nottingham is not against that. He actually thinks we should learn a little bit from the New Zealanders. Nottingham gives an example. In the London Olympics, Team Great Britain won 175 medals, of which about 65 were gold medals. It was the best they have ever done, right? Across all the social media, every single Brit posted, well, this is quite good. New Zealand won 3 medals, 2 silver and 1 bronze, and you have thought that they had conquered the world. They were talking about how they were so proud of the athletes. They were giving this royal welcome when they came back home. Everything was all over the social media. So maybe a strategy for improving educational communication on a societal level is to be shouting out from the rooftop about optimal educational accomplishment and successes in education.
Instead of talking about barriers and strategies for promoting optimal learning, let's have a look at the school management level. Our experts talk about the responsibilities of a school management and the possible barriers of not being able to seek the positive or avoid the negative, of not being able to lead with great courage and to dare to lead the way, or not being supported and in a good position for management.
David Budd talks about how to overcome barriers for school management. He says it takes courage from a school. It takes a courageous step to break the mold, to break out of the status quo. Brené Brown from University of Houston, Texas, says that we can choose courage or we can choose comfort, but we cannot choose both. It requires schools like Geelong Grammar Schools and other leading schools to take a stance to say we are going to do things differently. That is what Geelong Grammar School did with positive education back in 2006. The principal, Stephen Meek, at the time said academic learning is no longer the number 1 priority for our students. It is number 2. Number 1 priority is the well-being of our students. If you do not like that as a parent, then you have to go somewhere else. I mean, that is brave, a courageous step to take, and it paid off. It is an obligation for schools like Geelong Grammar Schools and others to push the boundaries of what is possible to show and lead in that way. And it requires pioneers to show that it can be done differently. So what is one thing that you can do tomorrow to make the environment close to you more optimal? Think about that.
And finally, we have the individual teacher level. And one of the barriers our experts talk about, we have actually met ourselves several times. Martin Beyer from Roskilde University Center, Denmark, states that in the brown couch is a particular powerful group of teachers. It is the resigned, perhaps professionally skilled teachers who have both mentally and physically withdrawn from the engaging community. They sit with their arms crossed, obstructing development and waiting for an early retirement. So the brown couch has since become a term for a small but very powerful part of the country's teaching staff, which plagues the developmental environment and the working climate in schools by being resistant to change.
Sue Ruffy argues for a strategy to overcome negative voice and to create the changes that promotes more optimal learning. We need to have a huge sense of awareness and actually try our best to be positive and to deal with the negative voices. The first thing you can do if you're trying to change a school culture is to find out who else in the school shares your vision. And then you build upon this small steps. In the end, you try to make friends with those negative voices where you can, because they have always got their own agenda. But if you cannot, you are polite and you disagree with them very briefly when they say things that are not aligned with your vision. If you do not actually say something very brief, such as, I do not agree with you, or that is your view, it is not mine, then the voice becomes the dominant voice. It actually becomes the way culture is defined in your school, so you have to have different conversations so that your voices become the culture, and no, it is not happening overnight.
We have now highlighted some of the conversations we've had with the experts in the quest for optimal learning. And now you might be wondering what to do and where to start. The Danish behavioral design guru, Morten Münster, argues that it's not enough to create changes to have the knowledge about it and the motivation for it. We need to create concrete steps that can lead us in the right direction. So please consider one thing that inspired you, one thing that you will start doing straight away, and one thing that you will share with a colleague.
Thank you very much for attending this presentation. We hope that you will join us in the quest for optimal learning. You can find us at LinkedIn or at the website teachtools.dk. Our book is available at Amazon later this year in English if you're interested. We can do so much more together.
Thank you.